All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the slideshow PowerPoint presentations for Murachs, JavaScript, and jQuery 3rd edition for the AWD Application and Web Development 1000 Web Technologies class. I'm up to Chapter 10 of 18, and Chapter 10, which is a relatively short chapter, is on how to work with forms and data validation. We have one applied objective and 6 knowledge objectives. Our applied objective: use any of the jQuery selectors, methods, and event applications for working with forms and controls in a JavaScript app. In general terms, describe the HTML5 controls and attributes for forms. In general terms, describe the HTML attributes and CSS pseudo-classes for data validation. Describe the jQuery selectors for working with forms and controls, including input, text, radio, text box, submit, reset, button, disabled, enabled, checked, and selected. Describe the use of the jQuery trim method for working with text boxes. Describe the use of the jQuery focus, blur, change, select, and submit event methods for working with forms and controls, and describe the jQuery focus, blur, change, select, and submit methods for triggering events. Now, much of the stuff that's in this chapter, we are learning how to use jQuery to work with forms, and then we're learning some basic skills for using JavaScript for data validation in the browser. But it's not my intention in here to go through the HTML5 form properties, so this may be a fairly short lecture. In other words, I think you should be able to build that form that's shown right there. You should have a good understanding, because by the time we get to this video, we have gone through a book with about 18 or 19 chapters on HTML, including a very long chapter on forms and form validation, where I built a form. All right. You should also understand what this is, that it's a query string. And the query string is actually what comes after the question mark. So the email address will be judy@murach.com, and the first name will be Judy. All right. The major elements of attributes of a form element: the name is the name you use to refer to it in either client-side or server-side code. The action is typically .aspx or .jsp or .php file that you want to have called. So it's after you click the submit button, it's the server-side file that you want to call to work with the form that you have just submitted. And method, which is either get or post. Now, a form contains one or more controls, also known as fields. When you click on a submit button for a form, the form is sent to the server as part of a hypertext transfer protocol request. When you click a reset button on the form data is set to its default values. When a form is submitted to the server for processing, the data is sent along, and that's the data in the controls is sent along with the HTTP request. When you use get, everything is shown up in your address bar in what's called a query string. When you use post, that information is not shown, rather it's hidden, so to speak, in the hypertext transfer protocol or HTTP header. All right. So if you have information that's of a sensitive nature, passwords, credit cards, any kind of personal information, you will use a post for that rather than a get. Now, this chapter kind of concentrates on data validation, and that refers to checking the data collected by a form to make sure it's valid and complete. Now, you always do complete data validation on the server, but if you can do the same kind of validation on the client using JavaScript, that saves what are called round trips to the server. Because if I don't do any validation on the client and I click the submit button and send my form out to the server and there are mistakes in it, the server has to still process it and then send it back to me. That's the round trip. And when the data isn't valid, to make sure that these unnecessary round trips don't take place, some to all validation will be also done on the client. This doesn't typically have to be as thorough as what's done on the server, and you do it both on the client and the server. One of the reasons that you have to do it on both is it is possible for a user to turn JavaScript off on their client or on their own machine. And if they do that, it gets sent right to the server anyway. So here are some major terms regarding, you should understand what a form is, what a control is, what a field is, what the submit button does, what the reset button does, and what data validation does. Now these are HTML5 controls. So email will actually check to make sure, rather than saying type equal text, when you say type equal email, the system will look on the client side to make sure the email has been formatted correctly. URL does a similar thing with URLs. Tel is a telephone number. Now that one is fairly recent and it's not well supported by a lot of browsers. Number, again, when supported, allows you to put a minimum and a maximum. So let's say I wanted the user to be able to enter a test grade. I could set the minimum to 0 and the maximum to 100. Then they couldn't set a grade that was out of range. Range, again, so if I want to be able to say, maybe you're going to do some kind of you're going to give me an estimate for a job. And maybe I've got it in there where I've got a range from 1,000 to 10,000. That maybe the step value is by 1,000. So the only values I can put in are 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000, 9,000, and 10,000. All right. Date, which gets a date entry with min and max attributes. Typically, it'll include a pop-up calendar. And time, which will have arrows, which will allow you to set hour, minute, second. Now, things that you use for this include autofocus. Autofocus is a Boolean attribute that tells the browser to set the focus on a field when the page is loaded. Typically, it's the first field in a form. Doesn't have to be. And placeholder, which is temporary text in the field that is removed as soon as the user clicks in it and puts something in. So many of the HTML5 input controls provide for basic data validation, all right, but not all. Here's an example of using some of them. Now here are some HTML5 attributes for data validation, all right. Required is a Boolean attribute meaning true, false. And if you put required on a field, a value is required for that field. Title is the text that's displayed in the tooltip when the mouse hovers over the field. It's also the text displayed after the browser's default error message. Pattern allows you to use regular expressions to validate field entries. No validate basically is a Boolean entry, and if it's set, it tells the browser that it shouldn't validate the form or a control that it might be set for. And autocomplete, if it's set to true, it'll automatically complete, a form based on entries you've made previously. Now, two of the reasons why you need JavaScript for data validation are, one, the HTML5 input controls and attributes for data validation aren't implemented in all current browsers, and even the ones that implement them may not do it in the same way. Two, HTML is limited in the types of validation it can do. It can't check whether a field is equal to another field, or look up a state code in a table, for example. As of the current writing of this book, which is, let's see, it's got a 2017 publish date, which means it was written in 2016, which means it's somewhere between a year and a half and 2 years old at the time this recording is being made. So Chrome, IE, Edge, Firefox, and Opera all support, in some form or other, the HTML5 attributes and the CSS3 pseudo classes that are shown here. Okay? Even so, you typically need to use JavaScript or JavaScript along with using some jQuery in order to make sure stuff works. All right. So shown on page 297 in the book are some of the jQuery selectors for form controls. Again, I'm not going to read all these. All right. jQuery provides special selectors for selecting the controls on a form. For example, the val method can be used for getting and setting the value in a control, and there's a trim method that can be used to remove all the spaces at the start and at the end of a string. So this table that's right here summarizes the jQuery selectors you can use with forms. They make it fairly easy to select various types of controls. All right, most of them dovetail with the name of the corresponding control. The jQuery event methods for forms are shown on page 299 in the book. This table that's right here summarizes the jQuery event methods for working with forms. A lot of these we've already looked at. For instance, the focus event method is run when the focus moves to a selected element. The change method is run when the value in the selected element is changed. All right, the submit method runs when the submit event occurs. That event occurs when the user clicks on a submit button or when the user moves the focus to the submit button and presses the enter key. Now this table summarizes the jQuery methods for triggering or starting events. So you can use event handlers for focus, blur, change, and select to process data as the user works with individual controls. So you can add JavaScript and jQuery to your HTML5 controls, and if the user does something they shouldn't do, you can keep them stuck on a field or move back to a field or whatever. Set a default, whatever it is you have to do. You can use an event handler for the click event of a regular button, not a submit button, to validate data within a form. Then if the data is valid, you can use the submit to submit it. So you can, rather than just clicking the submit button and having it go off to the server, all right, you can click the submit button and have other things happen first. You can also use an event handler for the submit event of a form to validate data before it's sent to the server. All right, that way, if any data isn't valid, you can use that prevent default that we talked about earlier to keep the user from actually submitting something to the server when it should not do so. So the chapter ends on the last 4 pages by going through this example. And the author says here, as you will see, jQuery makes it easy to access the user entries and display error messages. To test the validity of the user entries, you need to use JavaScript. So the idea is when you leave stuff off here, you're going to get messages over here. So this figure presents the user interface, and then underneath it on page 301, the HTML for the validation application. To use this form, it's expected that the user will enter data into the text boxes. There's also radio buttons that you can see. By default, the individual radio button is going to be selected, so one will always be selected. By default, the company name box is disabled. If the user clicks the corporate radio button right here, this becomes enabled. If you click again here, it becomes disabled. There's the HTML. And the JavaScript for the application is shown on page 303 in the book. This is some of the JavaScript in the Ready event handler. The event handler contains 2 additional event handlers, one for the change event of the 2 radio buttons and the second one for the submit button of the form. To select the two radio buttons, the change event handler uses the :radio selector, and that works because the form only contains one group of radio buttons. Within the change event handler, the val method is used to get the value of the checked radio button, and that value is assigned to a variable named radio button. To get the checked radio button, both the :radio and :check selectors are used. The event handler for the submit button of the form contains the validation routines for all of the text boxes on the form. Now, not all of it is shown here, but the idea, as the author says, is you should be able to get an idea of what's going on taking a look at this. The validation for the email entry shows how to use a regular expression. And that is right over here. The jQuery trim method is used to trim each entry before it's tested to make sure the user didn't just hit the space bar or put in any extraneous beginning or ending blank spaces. After the validation, a final if is used right here to test the isValid attribute. If it's false, it means one or more of the fields is invalid. In that case, the prevent default method is passed to the submit event so that it doesn't actually send the form to the server. Okay? And that's pretty much it for this chapter. Now, when I come back, there are two more chapters in this section. Okay, so let me just quickly show you those. All right, those will be chapter 11 and chapter 12, which I will go over tomorrow. All right, students will be coming in here fairly soon. So, chapter 11 is on how to use jQuery plugins and the jQuery UI widgets, and I will show some examples there. And then chapter 12 will be on how to use AJAX, which is asynchronous JavaScript and XML, JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, and Flickr. So we'll come back and talk about those tomorrow.